I had this really great conversation with Lisa Titus about attributing intelligence and understanding to people and attributing intelligence and understanding to AI, specifically chatbots. So think ChatGPT or GPT 4.0 or Bard or whatever you want. The conversation has lots of high points. I want to focus on a few in this intro so you know what to look for. One thing that we talk about is behaviorism. So behaviorism is, there's lots of subtlety here, but the core of behaviorism is that something like, don't pay attention to so-called mental states, psychological states like what you think, what you feel, what you believe. Forget about that stuff. What we need to pay attention to in psychology is behavior. We have to look at the behavior of people. The thought was something like, look, all these so-called inner states, like desires and beliefs, feelings, sensations, those things are not scientifically investigatable. We can't measure those things. We can't observe those things because they're too internal. And so good science, so the behaviorist thought went, good science deals with the observable, the measurable, etc. And so behaviorism held sway in psychology for many, many, many years. No surprise then, as Lisa explained, that Alan Turing, when he devised the Turing Test, was a behaviorist of sorts. He thought that if a computer can convince someone that they're engaging in a real conversation with a person, then the machine is intelligent. Forget about what's going on underneath the hood, so to speak. What matters is that it's behaving in an intelligent way, and since behavior is what matters for being intelligent, it's intelligent as long as it behaves intelligent. Now, there's some of that around today. Now, not in academia, at least not to my knowledge. Behaviorism is a defunct theory, but you'll very often hear people in tech, and I'm thinking in particular of Sam Altman, saying things like, artificial general intelligence is here when an AI can perform the kinds of tasks and the range of tasks that humans perform. But that's a straight up behavioral analysis of what constitutes intelligence or understanding. It's defunct. Moreover, we don't talk about the Turing test very much right now. In fact, current AI has passed the Turing test. But there are lots of researchers who talk about AI passing other kinds of tests and thereby concluding that we've got intelligence here. So for instance, we have AIs passing the bar exam or the LSAT or medical tests. So the thought is, if it can do this well on these tests, it is thereby exhibiting intelligence and it is thereby intelligent. But I don't think this is right for a variety of reasons. Neither does Lisa. One question she asks, almost in passing, although it is central and I really want to highlight it, is she says something like, how do we understand the functionality of the system? How do we understand the functionality of the system in relation to its outputs, in relation to what it says? This seems really important. If you want to think about the functionality of the system, I've already used a metaphor for this kind of thing. It's what's going on under the hood. And Lisa thinks that we're not going to know whether the output is genuinely exhibiting intelligence if we do not have a good grip on the mechanisms that are giving rise to those outputs. If we can't know what's going on inside or have a decent understanding of what's going on inside to produce those outputs, we can't know that the outputs are intelligent or not. One quick example that I use in my conversation with Lisa, although she provides other examples that are arguably better, you might invite someone over for dinner. You can say, hey, would you like to come over for dinner? And maybe I'm doing that because I like their company or because I have ulterior motives around getting a job or something along those lines. But it's because I engage in those kinds of deliberations. Oh, if I invite this person over, my kid will get into college, et cetera, et cetera. And then I say, would you like to come over for dinner? You can see that output of mine, what I'm saying, as intelligent behavior. If instead, though, I was talking to some person and I leaned against a wall and my finger slips into an electrical socket and I get electrocuted and electricity courses through my body, including my brain, in a surprising way such that not only do I start, maybe instead of shaking, I blurt out, would you like to come over for dinner? No deliberation, no rationality there, just a blurting out of a string of words that make it sound like I'm doing something that's an expression of my intellect, when really it's just these weird neural firings as a result of getting electrocuted. So if you think that in that second case where I get electrocuted and I just blurt out, would you like to come over for dinner? It's not a case of me exhibiting intelligence, but the first one is, then when you come to an AI, so goes Lisa's thought, we need to know what's going on under the hood to know if it's the kind of thing that makes us conclude that it's outputting something intelligent. Is what's going on under the hood of an AI like me deliberating about whether to invite that person, or is it more like the electrical socket case? And Lisa thinks, as do I, it's more like the electrical socket case. She gives a better example, I think, so does she actually, than the electrical socket case, but it's intuitive, so I hope that's some help in getting you to get a grip on the kind of conversation that's going on here. Okay, so that's one thing that I want to highlight. The other thing that I'll highlight, which is just a sort of sneak preview, is towards the end of the conversation, we turn to the ethics of LLMs, and she thinks that there are two interrelated ethical risks as they pertain to LLMs. One having to do with the risks of anthropomorphizing LLMs, that is to say, attributing intelligence or understanding or personality to them when in fact they have none, and relatedly, that we're given to overly trust these things. So the conversation is primarily maybe 75-80% about intelligence and understanding, and maybe 15-20%, something like that. I think I got the numbers wrong already, about the ethical impacts of thinking about LLMs as intelligent or not. Okay, so those are the things that I want to highlight. Other bookkeeping things, if you've got a guest that you want me to talk to or an issue you'd like me to address, please email me, that is ethical machines, em@reedblackman.com. I will read your email. And the other thing is, please, if you like this podcast, go give it a 5-star review, write nice things about it. If you read my book, Ethical Machines, please go review that on Amazon, give it 5 stars, because the Amazon algorithm really cares about that sort of thing. And that is all the housekeeping I have for now. All right, let's get to the conversation. You've been doing a lot of work around artificial intelligence and large language models in particular, and whether they're intelligent. Obviously, lots of people are quite impressed by these things. And I take it, tell me if I'm wrong, your main thing is too far. They're not smart, they're not intelligent. Do I have that right?
That's right. So, although the behavior of these models is really impressive, and I don't want to diminish that at all, I don't think that these systems are intelligent in the same way that humans and even animals are intelligent. So, I don't think that they understand in the same way that humans and animals do. And that's a really important difference.
Okay, so two questions off the bat then. One is, why don't they understand in the way that humans do, or animals? And relatedly, are you saying that there's a way in which they do understand? It's just a different way of understanding?
So, I want to push back against the idea that they understand at all. And part of that is because of how these systems are trained and what they're optimized for. So models like ChatGPT and other generative AI are optimized for prediction. So they're trained on large data sets and they're optimized to give you back. This is a simplification, but they're optimized to give you back something that could be in the data set, right? And so they produce text for these text models, but also pictures and so on that looks really meaningful. But I think that that has to do with the fact that humans meaningfully use text and systematically use text. So the AI can pick up on these statistical relationships, say this word will tend to come near this word to produce this meaningful behavior, but it doesn't really understand what it's doing.
Well, so then let me ask you this. If understanding is not a matter of something like, I don't know, having a representation, I mean, maybe that's not even the right phrase, having a representation of the statistical likelihood that two words or a set of words is going to coexist or something like that, co-locate. What is human understanding then if it's not that?
Yeah. So, Reed, when you're deciding whether or not you're going to enroll your kids in gymnastics or karate, let's say,
Sure.
you're considering what the benefits are of each of these different kinds of physical activities for your kid. And maybe you're considering how close the karate studio is versus the gymnastics studio and so on. There are lots of factors that come into play in making that decision. And so you are thinking about not just, and when maybe you're talking about it with your partner and so on, when you guys are talking, you're talking about the things out there in the world, gymnastics versus karate, various considerations. You're not talking about or producing words based on how they tend to co-occur in word
Sure.
corpora,
Yeah.
right? And so we are sensitive to the meanings of the words that we use. We make decisions in ways that are sensitive to the meanings of those words, and we act in ways that are sensitive to the meanings of those words. And these large language models are just not designed to do that. They don't function in the same way. They aren't optimized to be sensitive to the meanings of the words that are used as prompts or as answers.
All right, so okay, you've got this notion of being sensitive to the meanings of the words, which yeah, I'm on board with. I think that's probably right. But let me sort of push back a little bit as a kind of devil's advocate. Why not say something like, well, look, the way that we got to be sensitive to the meanings of the words is by being repeatedly exposed to those words, say in conversation or something like that. We were around our parents, our siblings, whatever, friends, and they were talking, family, and they were from hearing all those words, we got sensitive to the meanings of those words. That's what language acquisition looks like. So why not say something like, look, these LLMs, they become sensitive to the meanings of the words by being around, the analog of people speaking a bunch around them. It's people, if, as it were, writing a bunch around them, and they're looking, as it were, metaphorically looking around or hearing these things or reading these things, and so they're acquiring an understanding of the meaning in the same kind of way.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. And I think there are a few things to say about it. So, one thing to say is that for sure, part of our cognitive capabilities are due to our brains being able to predict. We do know that our brains are partially trying to predict what words are going to come next and so on. So, nothing I want to say denies that at all. The
Mm.
question is whether that is sort of like most of our capacity for understanding or largely explains our capacity. And that I want to resist. So I think there's a whole lot more that goes into our capacities for understanding and language than just that. So we're not just looking at relationships between words and words, we're looking at relationships between words and the world. But we're also gaining an understanding of what happens in the world and we're predicting, you know, what will come next in the world. The other thing I wanted to say about that is that you might have the view, and some people have sort of suggested this, that the reason why these generative AI models are so good is because they actually are picking up on these kinds of meaning related properties. So you optimize them over these big corpora, text corpora, and somehow they learn to pick up on these semantic relationships. And I think that there are different ways to try to analyze these systems. So with an AI system that you train up, you don't really understand lots of the internal functionality of the system. It's hard to figure out, okay, this is exactly how this response was produced. But you can kind of probe the system to try to understand which aspects are responsible and why. And so some people are trying to make that case, but I don't think that we've gotten very far in analyzing the functionality of these systems in order to make that case. I think there's a simpler hypothesis, namely that the behavior is produced by sensitivity to these statistical properties that it's optimized for.
Mm.
So I think it's a more complex hypothesis that somehow it's picked up on these meaning properties. And so it needs extra support.
All right. So one thing that you said that was interesting is that the way that it usually goes is they're not, when humans understand what they're doing is not predicting next word probability or something along those lines. They're doing something else. And one thing that you said that was interesting is actually we are doing that. That is a thing that we are doing, but it's not the only thing that we're doing. It's not even arguably the lion's share of what we're doing when we understand. And so we don't even have to resist the claim that humans engage in next word prediction. We'll grant the premise, we'll grant that claim, and then just make the claim that, but it's not enough, it's not sufficient. Even though we do that, it doesn't constitute human understanding, and it's a small it's either not an ingredient of human understanding, or if it is an ingredient, it's a relatively small ingredient. So that's one thing that I thought that's sort of an interesting move to just say, yeah, fine, we predict too. Just that's just not what human understanding is. The other thing I take it is something like there's data that needs to be explained, right? Tell me if I've got this right. There's data that needs to be explained. In this
Mhm.
case, these things are really good. I mean, yeah, they make really stupid mistakes as well, but in many cases, they're good enough for us to wonder how the hell can they be so good? And I take it you think that there's at least two explanations. One is They're just really good because they're really good at tracking statistical probabilities among sets of words. That's why. And someone else might say something like, well, it's that, but it's also that they're picking up on the meaning. And I take it that you think that the simpler explanation, it's just the statistical probabilities. It's not that they're also picking up on the meanings of words. We don't, that's enough to explain its relative success. Do I have that right? It's sort of like an Occam's
Yeah.
razor argument.
Yeah.
We don't need that extra
That's
bit to explain.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I'm not one of these people who thinks that AI could never be intelligent. But
Right.
I think that these systems, you can explain the behavior of these systems without positing this kind of understanding.
I mean, this is another, again, this is sort of a gentle pushback. I think I know what you're going to say. I think I know what I would say anyway. But, sometimes you ask it for things like, hey, why did you give that piece of advice? Why did you provide that diagnosis for that patient, given the test results that I gave you? And it'll say something like, well, I gave this advice for reasons X, Y, and Z. And it seems to give outputs, sentences, propositions, whatever you like, that purportedly justify that the output that they gave. Doesn't that show us, so the argument goes, doesn't that show us that there really is some deep connection between the outputs that it gives and the rationale that it gives for those outputs or for those claims?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think this is a place where we have to be really careful for a few different reasons. So, first of all, humans have this tendency to anthropomorphize. We do it not just with AI systems, but we do it with things out there in the world. I do it with my car, right? We're hardwired to attribute agency to things out there in the world. And so, this is something that's been well documented with AI systems ever since the 50s and 60s when the first
Yeah.
AI systems were coming out and people were really ready to attribute understanding to these systems. And today we would look at these systems and say, well, they're really simple. Really simple. There's no way that a system like Eliza, for example, that was an AI therapist
Right.
that had, by our standards, fairly simple code. There's no way she could be intelligent, even though people reacted really strongly and really viscerally to interacting with her. So I think we have to move beyond something like the Turing test, being able to sort of say or trick a human into thinking that the system is actually intelligent, to more rigorous ways of trying to assess this behavior. So typically that's done with what are called benchmark tests, where you sort of test the language model's behavior against, trivia question and answer set or some other kind of key questions and so on, and you try and gauge their performance that way. The trouble is that when you train them on these large data sets, that the answers or something very close to the answers is often in the data set. And so just because they show meaning-like behavior doesn't mean that they're actually understanding what they're saying. And sort of the third thing to consider is that just because an AI says, this is why I gave you the answer that I did, that doesn't mean that is actually true. It doesn't mean that it actually reveals the internal functionality of the system. That might just be the sort of thing that comes after the question, why did you say something like that?
Yeah.
So there might not be any connection between what the AI says and its internal functionality.
Yeah. I call this what I call the deliberation problem, which is that it purports to deliberate and that it gives what looks like reasons for its output, but in fact, it's done no such thing. The explanations that it offers for its advice giving are itself just a matter of stringing together the next probable words. And to us, it looks like the grounds on which it made that quote unquote decision, but it actually didn't do that at all. The Turing test and the
That's
benchmark
right.
stuff is really interesting because it's always just struck me as stupid, frankly. Because let's suppose you start with the distinction. So I want to hear what you think about this if I've got things wrong. There's a distinction between exhibiting intelligence and being able to fool someone into thinking that intelligence is being exhibited or something like that. Or there's expressing genuine intelligence and being able to fool someone that genuine intelligence is being expressed. Once you've got that distinction, which strikes me as a pretty elementary distinction, it's not that complicated. The Turing test is obviously just, I think, the wrong kind of thing to test for intelligence because X hypothesis, by hypothesis, there could be a perfectly deceiving thing that is just deceptive. So it would pass the Turing test, obviously, but by hypothesis, it doesn't actually have intelligence. I don't see why that would be the case. It's similar with the benchmarks. The sort of like, oh, we have benchmarks for, intelligence or something along those lines, and it has to do with behavior that's exhibited. But I mean, one, there's two things here. Number one, intelligence is not reducible to behavior, right? I mean, maybe behavior exhibits intelligence in various ways, but it's not identical to intelligence. Two, and relatedly, you've just got the deception, deceiver versus perfect deceiver versus actually intelligent thing distinction. So it can pass all the benchmarks, but maybe it's just a perfect deceiver again. So I don't even see how the Turing test or how these so-called like intellectual or intelligence benchmarks are even the right kind of thing to test for intelligence. It just seems to me completely barking up the wrong tree.
Yeah. So one thing we have to remember is that when Turing offered the Turing test, it was the heyday of behaviorism. And behaviorism was a
Ah,
movement that rejected this idea that there is this distinction between intelligent behavior and behavior that just looks intelligent but isn't really intelligent. Right. The idea was that we could analyze,
that's really interesting. Right, right.
right. So the idea was that we could analyze all these mental notions like thinking and reasoning in terms of their behavior. And so I think that gets lost when people talk about the Turing test today because people are assuming that it's still a valid test when our underlying thinking about the relationship between intelligence and behavior has changed.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I mean, so right, so behavior is just the view that there aren't something like these internal mental states because those aren't scientifically verifiable or something along those lines. You can't measure mental states. So since it's not on the scientific up and up, it's not measurable. We can't observe it. Must not be real. So it must be the case that being intelligent just is exhibiting certain kinds of behavior that we would count as intelligent. So that's super interesting, and that's why the Turing test got traction because they didn't make use of the distinction between seemingly intelligent and exhibiting intelligent behavior because they were in the grips of behaviorism. That doesn't show that, from my lights, that the Turing test isn't stupid. It just shows that it was based on a stupid, a stupid theory, and maybe we don't blame Turing for it for adopting the sort of stupid theory that was in vogue during his time. But that at least explains it. And then what's really interesting is that when you read the ways that like a Sam Altman talks about large language models and intelligence, it reads behaviorist. They'll say things like, its intelligence, artificial general intelligence is a matter of doing the tasks that humans can do. And if it can do all the tasks that humans can do, then we have artificial general intelligence. And I'm screaming like, that's behaviorist nonsense. But I never made the connection that you just made, which is it comes from the Turing test, and Turing was at least in the time when behaviorism had a grip on the natural sciences. So we can excuse Turing maybe, but I don't think we can excuse Sam Altman.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that there remains a thread of behaviorism through these whole discussions about intelligence. And I think people are ambivalent about it, right? So sometimes when you hear engineers talk about these systems, they use this really robust notion of intelligence or sentience or consciousness or something like that. And then when there's pushback against whether these systems actually have those robust intelligence or consciousness properties, those robust mental properties, then I find that there's often a retreat to this kind of behaviorist or operationalized notion of intelligence. And so part of what I'm really interested in
Yeah.
is how can we get more rigorous about this robust kind of intelligence to see whether or not the AI system has it or an AI system could have it in the future?
As you know, in philosophy of mind, there's this what we call the problem of other minds. It's sort of like, hey, how do you know that I have a mind? How do I know that you have a mind? How do we know that anyone has a mind? And there's not, as far as I know, a really good argument for showing us, oh, here's how I know that Lisa's not a robot, or here's how you know that Reed's not a robot, or something along those lines, or a philosophical zombie, as philosophers put it. It looks like we behave in ways that makes it look like we've got internal states, but we don't. And we don't have a really good answer to that. But if we can't have a good answer to how do we know that other people actually have internal mental states, that they have feelings and they have thoughts and emotions, etc., if we can't do that for humans, how could we possibly do that with AI?
Yeah, I think there are a few things to say about that. One is when the problem of other minds comes up, it often comes up in this kind of skeptical context where you have to show beyond any sort of reasonable doubt or objection that there are other minds, right? But we don't hold most of our knowledge to that high of a standard. And if you do, then you start getting into trouble all over the place, right? How do I know that
It's
I,
deep, right, right. Deep skepticism about everything.
right, exactly.
We're not in the matrix, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, sure.
Exactly. And so that's not the sort of level of certainty that we need for these kinds of discussions, I think. So then the question becomes, what is the best explanation of our evidence, right? And so I come at things from a physicalist perspective, which means that I think that our capacities for intelligence are based in physical stuff in the world, stuff in the brain, the relationship between the brain and the body and the environment. And because I am built more or less just like you, Reed, and I have these properties, intelligence, consciousness, and so on,
Hmm.
I should think that you have them too, because it would require some sort of special thing going on for you to be built just like me, but not
Yes.
have those properties. And so I think that actually,
Yeah, that's interesting. That's cool.
yeah. So I think that we're on pretty good grounds attributing intelligence to each other and to animals that are like us. Then you have animals that are very unlike us, like octopi, but they exhibit behavior that is so impressive that we think, oh gosh, they seem to be intelligent too. They're doing real problem solving. And so it's not just the behavior that we look at, though. We also try to understand the functionality of these systems, how their nervous systems get them to do the fantastic things that they do. And so that's the kind of approach that I think we can take towards AI systems. Behavior is important, but I think often we need more complex assessments of behavior than we often see with these systems. And it needs to be paired
Mm.
with looking at the functionality of the system and trying to understand whether the functionality is that of an intelligent system.
Yeah, so you had me for most of it, then I started to get a bit skeptical towards the end. So let's see if you can dissuade me of my skepticism. So I take it as something like this. All right, look, Reed, you want to know how we know that other people have minds, that they think about things, that they feel things, etc. And it's sort of something like, well, look, I have feelings, thoughts, etc. by virtue of roughly how my brain works. That I know it's more complicated than that, but roughly how my brain works. Neural firings and blah 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 blah. Okay. And I know that you've got those neural firings too. I know that other people have MRIs that maybe not you haven't seen Reed's MRI, but you've seen MRIs, you know they exist. People have neural firings in their brains. And it's just the thought as well, if I have thoughts by virtue of neural firings and they've got neural firings, it sure as hell seems like they're gonna have the thoughts and the feelings and the pain and the emotions and all that too. I like that. That's cool, especially if you think that all there is the physical. There's no soul or floaty stuff that mental states consist in. There's no mental substance or something along those lines. That's cool. And then you make a similar argument for like a dog, something like that. Their brains are different, but they're sufficiently similar in the right places, blah, 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 such that, yeah, probably when they exhibit pain behavior, it's because they're in a similar mental state that we're in when we're in pain, that owie feeling. I think that's the technical jargon. But then you said octopi, which, if people don't know, appear to exhibit phenomenally intelligent behavior, like means and reasoning. They can engage in problem solving, but their neural structures are. Do they have neural structures? They're very differently physically constituted than us and dogs and everything else. But then you start to say, well, so I can't do the thing that I do with other people that I do with octopi. But octopi, look at their behavior. It's so smart. Surely we should think it's because they're intelligent. But now I'm just going to say the same thing about AI, right? Maybe not today's AI, but tomorrow's AI. If I just ramp up its task performing abilities, it's going to be as good as an octopus. And then are we going to have to attribute intelligence to that thing?
Yeah, so this is where I think it gets really tricky. And these are the issues that I think are quite interesting. So with an octopus, it has a much more decentralized nervous system than humans and dogs do. And so that's part of what's interesting about it. Like, what is it
Mhm.
like to be an octopus if so much of your nervous system is in your legs? Right. And it's so decentralized. Right.
Okay.
And so there, I think there are reasonable opinions.
For what it's worth, I'm not sure that I know what it's like to have a central nervous system.
Oh,
Experientially. I mean,
sure.
if you told me that actually it's in your foot, I'd be like, holy shit, I cannot believe that. That's shocking, but I don't feel any different. Anyway,
Sure.
yeah.
Right. But you catch my drift, right? We have highly centralized nervous systems. And so we seem to have, and I think we do have this kind of unity of a conscious agential experience. And it's an open question whether the
Hmm.
octopus has that similar sort of thing or whether somehow they have a more decentralized experience, whatever that is. So I bring it up in part because I don't
Hmm.
think things are always super simple. I think there are really complex questions to ask here. And I think there are two different, really important components of trying to answer that question. One is, can we give good behavioral tests? What do those good behavioral tests look like? And for intelligence. And secondly, how do we understand the functionality of the system? And does that support claims to intelligence too? And these work hand in hand. So, because of these generative
Hmm.
AI models that are designed to produce predictive text, I think we have to be especially careful that we're not just looking at this kind of behavior and we're also looking at functionality because we should expect, given how the thing
So if I,
works, that it would produce behavior that would make us think it was intelligent when it's not.
so I guess the claim is something like, look, we have to understand something about how the intelligent behavior comes to be. There are certain kinds of, if you like, mechanistic or functional explanations for how that intelligent behavior comes to be engaged in by the entity, by whatever it is, whether it's a human or an octopus or a dog or a robot or whatever. And I guess your claim is something like there are certain kinds of understandings of the mechanisms that will show us that we've got intelligence. This is the strong version anyway. That will show us that there's genuine intelligence here. But there's other times where we'll understand the underlying mechanisms and we'll understand that the way those underlying mechanisms work show us that it's just a seeming of intelligent behavior, but it's not actually intelligent behavior. And so we're supposed to get at some point the ability to read off from how the mechanisms work an understanding of whether the mechanisms are working in a way that reveals intelligence or not. Do I have that right?
Yeah. So I don't want to get too in the weeds about the relationship between sort of person level thinking and behavior and underlying mechanisms. There's a lot we could say there. And I think sort of the main point I want to make,
Species level.
yeah,
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 species level is
yeah.
fine.
But that's right. So when I give, I don't know, when I invite a friend over for dinner, let's say, right? Presumably there's some thinking that goes into that invitation, right? And I think about, oh, it would be nice to have them over and so on and so forth. And so at some level, you should be able to causally explain why I gave that invitation in terms of considerations about the other person, about how I would like to spend my Friday evening, and so on, right? If you found out that really the causal explanation was something totally different, like, I don't know, that I'm let's give another intelligent example just to sort of get this on the table, right? Maybe I don't like the other person at all and I'm just trying to, you know, nab a professional opportunity or something like that, right? The sort of thinking that produced the behavior is important for our understanding of that behavior, right? Now imagine that
Mm,
it was Mhm.
yeah.
Well, now imagine
No,
that
please
I'm not
go on.
trying to invite you over for dinner at all. I'm just it's a language I don't really understand, and I'm just stringing together words. And
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
then you would say, "Well, I didn't even really invite you over to dinner. I looked like I was inviting you over to dinner, but I wasn't really doing the same meaningful thing that someone else would do with those same words."
Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. So, right, there's some calculated behavior there is some behavior that could reveal some calculations. Like if I invite this person over for dinner, they're going to come and then I can schmooze with them. And that's going to increase the probability that I'm going to, you know, get a job or get hired or get a recommendation or whatever I'm trying to accomplish. So there's sort of, Machiavellian, kinds of things there. And so if we have an explanation that maybe we analyze the brain or something, we do something and we see that it's engaging in this kind of, let's just say for the sake of argument, it's associated with the prefrontal cortex or something like that. You could see something like advanced reasoning going on in the brain, or the brain is lighting up at those places that are associated with advanced reasoning. On the other hand, if the part of the brain lights up that's just sort of like, I don't know, you know, some weird part of the brain that has to do with, I don't know, I don't even know what the appropriate thing is. Something else, not the prefrontal cortex. And you just so happen to utter these words. Or, it turns out that you just got hit in the head with a rock and that rock, or you just stuck your finger in an electrical socket by accident and the electrical circuits lit up the brain. And then you just said, would you want to come over on Thursday? Then it's like, yeah, something's funky about that pathway to you saying, do you want to come over,
Yeah.
such that it doesn't actually exhibit intelligence.
Yeah. So here's maybe even a better example. So suppose that you're in college, you're taking a test, and you have the kid who studied really hard and understands the answers and gives you the correct answers on the test, right? And then you have the kid who didn't really follow what was going on, but came to the lectures, but was on their phone maybe. And, not that anyone would do this, but there you go. And so this kid just writes down words that they've heard in connection with the words in the prompts, right? Now,
Mm,
today's humans, right? Typically,
yeah.
the second student is going to perform worse than the first student, a lot worse, right? And so you're going to be able to tell
I
this kid
suppose they
doesn't,
perform well. Yeah.
right? This kid doesn't know what they're talking about. They're just spouting things that they've heard in class that are related to the prompt words,
Yes.
right?
Yeah. I was gonna say, this is me. I lived this example because when I was in high school taking physics, the tests were always such that there'd be these prompts that would explain, the ball's flying through the air at a velocity of this, and there's a window, and there's a blah, blah, blah. And I wouldn't even read the things. I would just see the numbers, like see velocity, whatever, and then I'd plug them into an equation and I'd pop out the right answer. I have no idea. I had no understanding of the physics of it all. I had no clue, but I knew how to spit out the right answer because I knew how to engage in this sort of mechanism. I was a very lazy high school student, to be clear. Let's go. Look, there are the numbers. I see V equals this, M equals that. Okay, put it in the equation, bop, bang, boom, I'm done. And I did quite well. I think I got like an A minus, at least an A minus regularly on these tests. But I didn't understand anything. I just knew how to exhibit this behavior. So I think I've lived your example.
Yeah, right. And so if we think that there's an important difference between these two things, between really understanding the question and giving an answer that illustrates understanding
Yeah,
versus kind of plug and play, oh, this kind of question requires this kind of response, right? Then we should think
yeah,
that there's some, and we can get on this empirically somehow, right? There's some important distinction between the causal process that produced the behavior in one case and the causal process that produced it in the other.
yeah. That's cool. That's super interesting. I really like that. Wait, before we wrap up, I could dive deeper on this, but before we wrap up, I know that you think that while this is intellectually, philosophically interesting for its own sake, you also think that there are certain kinds of ethical implications to the kinds of conclusions that we come to. So tell me a little bit about the ethical implications of all this.
Yeah, so I think they fall into two main categories. One is so if you agree with me that these large language models like ChatGPT don't really have understanding, then we have to be really careful not to anthropomorphize them, right? For a variety of different reasons. So if they're used as chatbots, right, we have to be careful to protect the psychological well-being of the people they're interacting with, right? So we saw this now famous case of the Google engineer who thought that Lambda had become intelligent and was convinced, right? And many people think, you know, Lambda is not intelligent. I agree, right? For the reasons that we've been talking about.
Sure,
But if that's right, we need to be really upfront about how that there is this gap between intelligence and what these systems actually have in order to try to prevent people from getting too psychologically caught up in them. And this could be for all sorts of reasons.
yeah,
They might try to make friends with the AI. They might try to even get romantically involved with AIs and think that there's a
sure,
real human relationship. So I think the ethical concerns there are really important, especially because the behavior of these AIs is not always predictable or controllable. So although the people who build these systems have worked really hard to say prevent them from saying abusive things or doing abusive things, I don't think we're at the point where we can 100% guarantee that that's not going to happen, right? And so the more we
sure.
attribute intelligence to these systems, the more the potential for perhaps psychological abuse even. So I think we have to be really careful about that. The sort of last thing in the kind of first category of problems about sort of anthropomorphizing these systems is that we have limited resources. And I think that if we if we put these AIs in the category of intelligent beings, we might want to extend them certain rights that other intelligent beings have. And people talk about this in the ethical literature. And so
Hmm.
I think we need to keep the humans who are involved at the kind of ethical center of all of this. And so our
Mm.
tendencies to anthropomorphize these systems might lead us to shift resources from the actually sentient intelligent beings towards these AI systems.
Yeah, right. Right. You mistakenly give an AI or a bunch of AIs rights, and then they come into conflict with some human rights, and then you defer. Let's say in some cases you say, well, the AI's rights are greater than the human's rights. Meanwhile, due to a complete misunderstanding, it's not an intelligent system, it's not a sentient system, it's not a conscious system. And so now you're sacrificing the rights of a human for a fantasy,
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
which of course has never been done in the history of humanity before.
Right. The other sort of bucket of ethical concerns that I think are really important related to these generative models has to do with reliability and truthfulness. So, if we keep in mind that these systems are designed to predict and to produce predictive responses, as opposed to meaningful responses, right, then we make sense of some of the problems that people have found, like hallucination, right? Hallucinating sources or answers or things like that, not providing truthful responses. And I think that's really important to keep in mind because although they look like they're producing meaningful, they're giving meaningful responses, they're not. And so if we keep in mind how the system is actually trained and what it's optimized for,
Mm.
this makes a lot of sense. And so we talk about how do we provide safeguards for reliability and truthfulness for these systems. I think there need to be more upfront discussions about how hard exactly this is. So, if you look at some of the technical papers on these kinds of systems, what you find is that the engineers increase the truthfulness of these systems mostly by preventing the AI from answering in certain contexts. So, we have some idea
Mm.
okay, this is going to be a situation in which the AI is not going to be able to produce a truthful response or might not produce a truthful response. So we're just not going to let it answer the question. And that is a way to improve reliability,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
right? But it's not a way to make the system as a whole tend to track the truth better, right? That's not what it's doing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So another
No,
issue
please go on.
in the same vein is overtrust, right? So these systems look like they're meaningful and trustworthy and so on. And that's going to tend to lead to overtrust. And we know that humans tend to overtrust AI systems. So consider self-driving cars, right? People often say, well, if you put a human in the driver's seat, that human can, intervene if the car is going to do anything
Yeah,
wonky. Turns out that's actually very difficult for a human to
right.
do. We lose our,
Sure.
it's hard to keep your attention focused if you're not actually driving. People tend to overtrust what the car is doing and so on and so forth. And the same thing is going to happen for these AI systems. So one thing I see a lot around generative AI is people saying, well, you can have a human check whether or not the AI is giving you the right answer. And I think that's important, but I also think we should talk more about the psychological difficulty of that. People are just not going to be as attentive or check as hard
Mhm.
as they would if they were coming up with the first draft on their own. So I think that's really important. Um,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I take it your general point something like, and it's really related to your first one, which is that anthropomorphizing the AI will lead to an over reliance on it, or an inability, or at least a psychological impediment to checking its outputs, verifying its outputs, or something along those lines. So it's sort of instrumentally bad because one thing we need to do is we really need to do our due diligence with the outputs of these things, and especially in high risk cases. And if we anthropomorphize, which is likely to happen if we don't actually understand how these things work, we're even more vulnerable to these things.
that's right. And because they do often produce useful or meaningful looking responses, we're going to tend to default to their outputs and not check them as closely as we otherwise
Right.
would. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Wonderful. Now we just have to overcome people's ability to anthropomorphize the thing that they engage in a conversation with. That should be easy.
Right? It's no easy task. And so I think for me,
All right.
this is where the really interesting
No.
ethical questions are is how do we develop the human AI system so that we're not harming people, right? So that we're not making big mistakes and harming
Yeah.
people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this is just the beginning. I mean, it's hard for us to not anthropomorphize a chatbot. Just wait until it's not a chatbot, but it's a chatbot embedded in a virtual, avatar that looks and feels and says, "You're hurting me," or, "You hurt my feelings." Ugh, we're screwed. That's my version. That's my claim. That's my conclusion. We're screwed. I think
Yep.
that's right. I don't know. You seem more optimistic than me.
I am. I mean, I try to think of myself as, walking a kind of pragmatist line between the people who are, I think,
Yeah.
overly optimistic, who think that, oh, we already have intelligent technology and it's going to be so great for society, and people who are really pessimistic who think we could never have intelligent technology or it'll be really terrible. I think there is a lot of potential for this technology, but we really have to keep in mind how it differs from human and even animal systems in order to appropriately harness that technology
Yeah,
and
no.
use it for good. Yeah,
Yeah. No, we are on the same page on that front. I call it pragmatic optimism.
I love
Like
that.
theoretically, in the classroom, I'm like, oh boy, it's going to be a disaster. But you can't have that attitude if you're going to actually take action. So you sort of take what I call pragmatic optimism. Like, if the world's going to bend towards justice, here's the kinds of things that we would have to do. So let's go do those things. You know, but I'm just not sure that the antecedent, the if, is going to turn out to be right. Anyway, thank you so much, Lisa. This has been super interesting, super fascinating. And I know that you're doing some other work on AI and ethics. And so I hope you'll come back at some point.
Thanks a lot, Reed. I would love to. This has been so fun.